Right, so chapter 40 is going to overview animal form and function, some different characteristics we're going to see throughout the animals we're going to explore in the body systems. These form and function properties are going to be seen at all levels of organization throughout our animals. A lot of you have already taken honors anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is looking at just the biological form, while physiology is looking at the functions. So when we look at the form of an organism and examine the functions it's able to perform, we see there's often pretty solid correlation between the two. The size of the organism, as well as its physical shape, will help to determine how that particular organism is going to be able to interact with its environment. And these different body plans that have been developed are a result of evolution and are determined by our genetics. So there are physical laws that definitely determine the strength of your organisms, how things diffuse throughout it, how it's able to move, and how it's able to exchange heat. As organisms grow in size, they've got to be able to handle those different characteristics by having changes in their skeleton that have happened over time that will allow them to be able to support that mass. So materials have to go from cells, have to come into organisms and have to be able to leave organisms, nutrients, waste products, and gases. They've got to be able to be exchanged across those cell membranes. And that rate of exchange is going to depend on how much of the surface area is available for the cells to allow that to happen. And it's going to be proportional to the volume. We've talked about that a little bit earlier on in this year. That was when we used those agar cubes and talked about how the dye was diffusing through them. So some examples of this, a single cell protist has got enough plasma membrane to be able to take care of all of the cytoplasm's needs. Multicellular organisms that are more of a sac-like body plan have 2 cells thick, will also be able to allow diffusion of materials. If you have tapeworms, more flat animals, the distance between those cells and the environment is going to be simplified as much as possible. And as we get more complex, such as in humans, we've got lots of folded internal surfaces that help to allow those materials to be exchanged from one side to the other. And that space between the cells is filled with what's called an interstitial fluid that helps to facilitate the movement of those materials. And really, it just depends on what type of environment that particular organism is in and what type of shape as and size it is in order to determine how that's going to be set up. And by having these inner foldings, um, depending on what type of organism you are, you're able to help maintain that internal environment so that you keep everything that was within the organism stable. So these are just some pictures showing that exchange process happening. So we've talked a lot about cells this year. We know that that cells, once they have become determined, will be organized into tissues. Those tissues will have set functions. Tissues can be used to make up organs. Organs get to be used to make up organ systems. And those together make up the body of that particular organism. So these are just some examples of different organs systems. We're not going to cover all of these in this unit, but we are going to cover a good chunk of them. So the first thing we're going to talk about are tissues. We talked about how cells get determined to be different types of tissues that will have specific functions. And these functions can be throughout the body of that organism: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. So the first one we're going to look at is epithelial. We most often refer to epithelial within the human body as your skin. Covers the outside of the body, but it also is found within the body. It lines your organs and your cavities. The cells are very close to one another. You can have different shapes for your epithelial cells, and you can have different arrangements for your epithelial cells. Cuboidal, columnar, squamous, simple stratified, pseudostratified. And I'll show you some pictures of those on the next slide. So you can see the different types of epithelium that are present in this organism and where they're located at. Connective tissue is going to be used as a way to bind and support your other tissues. It is dispersed throughout the extracellular matrix, which is just fibers that are more like jello. Um, the types of connective tissue fiber, again, they're made of protein, are your collagenous fibers, your elastic fibers, and your reticular fibers. Um, the collagenous fibers or collagenous fibers help to give you strength and flexibility. It's what allows our skin to be pliable. The elastic fibers allow them to return back to the length they were to start with so they don't get overextended like rubber bands can be. And then the reticular fibers are used to connect connective tissue to adjacent tissues. Examples of connective tissue include your fibroblasts and your macrophages. The fibroblasts are what are going to be used to help get the proteins that we need in those extracellular fibers, and the macrophages are a big part of our immune system. So, six different types of connective tissue that we tend to see in vertebrates. We use connective tissue to kind of help hold our organs in place and to bind our epithelia to the tissues that are underneath them. So, we kind of talked about in cells how you had different types of fibers kind of helping to hold the framework of the cell together. We have the same thing happening with our organs and with the tissues that are making up those organs. Cartilage is another big one. Um, the connective tissue that we find in tendons that allows us to attach those muscles to our bones, as well as ligaments, which attaches the bones to the joints or connects the bones at the joints. Adipose tissue, which is able to store fat for insulation and fuel. And then we've got blood, the red blood cells, the white blood cells, the plasma. That is going to be another source of connective tissue. And then we have bone, the osteoblasts, the Haversian canals, that is going to help to form your skeleton. So those are some examples of the different types of connective tissues. And we look at them around that joint. We can kind of see how they all work in concert with one another. Another type is muscle tissue. Long cells called muscle fibers, they're going to contract based on signals from nerves. We have three main types of muscle tissue. We have the skeletal muscle, we have smooth muscle, and we have cardiac muscle. So, skeletal muscle, the striated form, that's going to be when you're making voluntary movements. Smooth muscle is when it's being directed by involuntary body activities, involuntary movements. Excuse me. And cardiac muscle is what allows your heart to function. Okay. So there are some examples of skeletal, smooth, and cardiac. So I had to take my cat in to have, I forget what kind of scan was done, and I did not know she wasn't supposed to eat beforehand, and you could see on the scan her stomach involuntarily moving back and forth digesting the food. That would be an example of smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle is, again, what allows us, and we'll spend much more time on the cardiac system a little bit later, but what allows our body to get oxygen to and from through out the different parts of our any organism's body. And then skeletal muscle is what allows us to, for some of y'all to be able to play soccer, for some of you to be able to swim or to cheer, and for some of you to be able to go work in a nursing environment. Nervous tissue. It is going to be able to identify stimuli and be able to kind of act as the control center to send out responses so that the body can, of that particular organism, can do what it needs to at that particular time. Again, we'll spend some more time on the nervous system. Neurons are going to be the way we are able to transmit those nerve impulses. And then the glial cells are what help to take care of those neurons because the neurons are not cells that are easily replaced. So you can kind of see there with glia, you often hear a lot of glioblastomas with brain cancers. You can kind of see why glia would be a big problem because you can see they are all scattered throughout. All right, how things work in terms of connecting within the body. We've got all these different types of tissues, and we need to have them be able to work in concert with one another. There's two main ways that we are able to send out information. One is through the endocrine system via hormones, and we talked about that a lot with cell signaling. Those hormones don't just go to one particular part of the body, they go throughout the body and they have to have the right receptor to be taken in. They will take a little bit of time, but they do last for an extended period. The nervous system is more of short and sweet. It gets that it needs to send out a signal, um, and so it does it pretty quickly. It's not the information that's being sent is based on that particular pathway. It's not based on what type of signal you're going through. And those impulses can be received by other neurons. They can be received by muscle cells, endocrine cells, or exocrine cells. So the nervous system is just going to get it to one particular spot, while hormones will get it to any particular spot that has that receptor that can take on that particular hormone. So, feedback control, we definitely spent a little bit of time with feedback control earlier on this year. Animals have to maintain their internal environment. So, in order to do that, they've either got to a there's one of two basic choices they have. They can deal with the environment they're in and adjust their temperature accordingly, or they can release heat or absorb heat to maintain a constant temperature, aka homeostasis. Regulators are going to be ones that are going to try to maintain homeostasis to keep the internal temperature fairly constant and make changes to allow that to happen. Conformers are going to have their internal temperature change based on the environment in which they're in. Some variables will have be able to be more of regulators. Other variables will be more likely to be conformers. So animals can have both of them. I think from the ones we've been going to be working with, we're mostly going to be focused on regulators or conformers when it comes to temperature. Okay. So here's an example of a river otter. You can see that the outside temperature has changed over a 40-degree period, and the body temperature has over a 40-degree interval. And you can see the river otter hasn't really changed a whole lot, while the largemouth bass is more of a conformer. You can see that as its temperature, internal temperature changes as the ambient temperature changes. We talked about how we're going to see more with the regulators with homeostasis, trying to maintain that steady state. We try to do that with humans, not just with body temperature, but also pH and glucose. And there are different mechanisms that can be used to help to maintain that. Typically, when you have gone too high or too low from one of those particular properties, that's kind of an indicator there's something going off, and that acts as a stimulus that would be recognized by different sensors. And we'll talk about what some of those sensors can be, and then what kind of response would happen. And that response would hopefully help return things back to where they need to be. So here is an example of heating a room. You want to be at 20 degrees Celsius. If the temperature starts to raise above 20 degrees Celsius, like you get a room of 20 kids in there and the temperature gets up, the heat would turn off and the temperature hopefully would go back down because you wouldn't have that external heat source helping to warm things up. If your temperature was too cold, then the heater would recognize, oh, wait, it's not warm enough, and would turn on to hopefully warm up the air in the room and get it back to that 20-degree temperature mark. So the homeostasis is going to be benefiting by a negative feedback loop, trying to get things back to where they were or to a range that's appropriate. And once you get to that point, it's going to shut things off until it's needed again. Positive feedback tends to make that stimulus become even more dominant and would not be very effective in maintaining homeostasis. An example of that would be with females giving birth. Um, Different hormones are going to be released, which is going to increase the contractions so that the baby is able to be born. So we can have homeostasis alterations with age. Um, when you were little, you most likely wanted to get up pretty early, and then you got to become a teenager, and a lot of teenagers like to sleep in. And as you get older, maybe you might shift a little bit more in one direction versus the other. But no matter what your age is, we typically refer to our days as a 24-hour period. And there's a rhythm that we go through sleep and awake and move around and then start to get tired and go back to sleep um, that governs the changes that occur in our bodies. And so when we have slight changes occur, like daylight savings, our body will readjust to those, acclimatization. Okay. So there's kind of a picture of when things are more likely to happen. I think my favorite on that diagram below with the human circadian clock was around 10 o'clock is the highest risk of cardiac arrest. Yay, fun. Because after you wake up, that's when you've had a big increase in your blood pressure and you start to move around. But that's what they've observed over time. And if you look up at the top, you'll see that as your body temperature increases over time, you see that your melatonin concentration decreases. And as your body temperature drops, your melatonin increases. And so, depending on when those levels tend to happen for you, tends to be when you are more interested in sleeping or more likely to sleep. Um, so homeostatic processes for thermoregulation. We're going to be looking at some different characteristics that can play a role with maintaining that thermoregulation, and that includes your form, your function, and your behavior. So thermoregulation is the big one, keeping things a pretty reasonable temperature internally. And you can have, we're not going to be talking about the chemistry form of endothermic, I promise. You can have animals that are endotherms and you can have animals that are ectotherms. Animals that are endotherms are able to help to maintain their body temperature by metabolism, by either taking in energy or by releasing energy. And birds and mammals would be examples of those. Ectotherms get their heat from something external. Your invertebrates, your fishes, your amphibians, your non avian reptiles. Your ectotherms are going to be able to accept a range of internal temperatures and be able to survive. Your endotherms aren't going to be able to have that range, but they're more likely to be active at different temperatures. Um, Keep in mind, though, that endothermy, because you have to make your own heat, is going to require more energy, therefore be more energetically expensive than ectothermy, which is just taking in heat from what's already there. So there's two examples of an endotherm and an ectotherm. So again, the walrus is generating its own heat, while an ectotherm is taking in heat from its surroundings. So poikilotherm and homeotherm. The body temperature of a poikilotherm varies with its environment. So, depending on what environment's in, the body temperature would vary. However, and you would think, okay, well, then that means it's going to be an ectotherm. If the environment the poikilotherm is in is a constant temperature, then it would not be considered to be an ectotherm. It would be considered to be, or sorry, it would not, let me make sure I get this right. Yeah. Poikilotherms don't necessarily have to be ectotherms. They could be endotherms because if they're just keeping that constant temperature, then that's not going to play a role. Homeotherms are going to have a fairly constant body temperature. So we're going to see that your homeotherms, yeah, are pretty much going to be your endotherms, but don't make the assumption that your poikilotherms are always going to be your ectotherms. Okay. Um, so heat source and body temperature is not necessarily fixed. We have to look at what environment they're in to make that call. Ways that we can exchange heat. radiation, evaporation, convection, and conduction. So there are some examples of that. Radiation is releasing it, conduction, absorbing it, convection is the waves, evaporation is allowing it to evaporate off. Okay. How we're able to regulate heat in mammals is through your integumentary system, your skin, your hair, and your nails. Um, Insulation through the skin, circulatory adaptations. We're going to spend some time with that with vasoconstriction, vasodilation, cooling by evaporative heat loss. That would be either through sweating or by taking a cold shower and allowing that heat to transfer to the colder water. Behavioral responses, and then adjusting the heat production metabolically speaking. So insulation helps to minimize the heat flow that's going to take place. So we tend to see that a lot with marine mammals. It could also be not just your skin, your feathers, your fur, your blubber. Okay. I said we were going to talk a little bit more about vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So, blood flow near the body surface will definitely affect thermoregulation if you have more blood towards your skin because you have vasodilation taking place. You're allowing that heat to get closer to your skin, and that's going to help to allow it to be able to leave the body and to decrease the temperature. While vasoconstriction, you're minimizing the heat loss. That would be more when you're cold and you want to keep as much heat inside your body as you possibly can. And I thought this was pretty wild. It says blood vessels in many marine mammals and birds allow for countercurrent exchange. Basically, it allows parts of the body to be colder than other parts of that particular organism. And so that the heat can be transferred from one part of that organism to another part while allowing some parts that would be losing heat, aka feet, or for birds, to be able to not lose that heat to keep in what they need to have. Um, and then this final one about endothermic insects have countercurrent heat exchangers that help maintain a high temperature in the thorax. You need that high temperature to be able to fly. And so by taking in the heat and kind of centralizing it around the thorax, it's going to be able to fly as opposed to if the heat is not kind of centered in that thorax, it's spread throughout the body, then it's more likely to stay on the ground. We actually use countercurrent exchangers with our kidneys. So there's kind of an example. You can see that with the dolphin. You can see that it's focusing on its. I'm really bad. This is my nephew's thing. Is flipper, and that is minimizing the heat loss that's happening as that flipper is moving, keeping the heat more concentrated toward the main portion of the bottlenose dolphin's body. And then the same thing down there with the Canada goose's legs. And I read that this is why in Alaska you can have some animals that can withstand temperatures of like -50, -60 degrees because of their ability to do this countercurrent exchange and not lose as much heat from in their feet. They were able to stay warmer than they would have if the heat was just consistently flowing throughout the whole body. We talked about cooling by evaporation. Panning obviously is going to help to release heat. Why you take cold baths or cold showers when you have a really high temperature. Again, that cold water is able to, heat's going to move from something warmer to something cooler. And so that the cold water is going to help to take heat out of your body and transfer it to that colder water. And then we talked about some behavioral responses that, depending on how you are physically present, that too can help to minimize or maximize how you take in heat. Thermogenesis. This is being able to adjust your metabolic production of heat to keep your temperature going. So if you are cold and like if you're out at a fire drill and you're not able to move around a whole lot, or sorry, if it's a cold day and you want to stay warm, you're going to move around, you're going to huddle, you're going to shiver. All of those things are going to help to make more energy, and that helps to keep your body warmer. You can also use hormones to help to improve that if you need it. So that's one way you can help to adjust your heat production. You can vary your insulation. So, depending on whether you're going into a colder environment or a warmer environment, if you tend to, your body will adjust to it in that particular way if you allow it to maintain those temperature changes and how that would impact on your body. I thought that's pretty cool. Ectotherms produce antifreeze compounds to prevent ice formation in their cells, kind of like our antifreeze in our car. Pretty wild. Um, I told you we talk about where in the body this thermoregulation is controlled, and that is the hypothalamus. And you'll get to see a feedback loop with that. Um, Fever is one way that we're able to maintain homeostasis in terms of our heat production within our bodies. So typically, we want to maintain a temperature of 36 to 38 degrees. If we are fighting something and we have an increased body temperature that is recognized by our hypothalamus, that will cause you to sweat, that will cause your vessels to dilate, hopefully helping to get more of that warmer blood out to your extremities so you can lose heat and reduce your temperature. If you are getting too low of a temperature, you're going through hypothermia, then your hypothalamus will also recognize that. It'll cause constriction to minimize the blood that's flowing to your extremities, and you will shiver to get those muscles moving to hopefully generate more heat so that your temperature will increase. Energy requirements. What we actually physically need is going to depend on the size and how much activity you're doing and the environment you're located in. And bioenergetics is just the overall study of this. We are not going back through photosynthesis and respiration, but that's what this is all talking about. Animals need energy from food. We get the energy in the food through respiration from ATP, and then ATP does everything we need for our cells. And once we have been kept alive, whatever's left of our food molecules can be used to help allow us to grow, repair things, make fat molecules, and produce your gametes. Okay. So, metabolic rate is how much energy we use over a period of time, and you can look at it by your heat loss. But what is probably a lot easier to measure is the oxygen being consumed or the carbon dioxide being produced. And I say that because you can't measure heat. You can calculate heat transfers, but you can't measure heat. It's just a pain. Basal metabolic rate is what you and I would look at to determine our metabolic rate because we would be endotherms, what you are at rest at a comfortable temperature. Well, ectotherms would have a specific temperature because they could be at a range of temperatures, and those are called standard metabolic rates. Um, no matter whether you're dealing with an endothermic metabolic rate or an ectothermic metabolic rate, you would be at a state where you're not growing, that you have not eaten for a while, and you are not in a stressful environment. Ectotherms are going to have lower metabolic rates than endotherms of the same size because, again, endotherms have to generate their heat, while ectotherms do not. So, factors that influence your metabolic rate are going to be your size, or one of the factors is going to be your size. Your rate is going to be proportional to your body mass raised to 3/4. So it's not quite a direct relationship, but it's going to be, or Y equals X relationship is going to be pretty close. When you are looking at it per gram of organism, however, even though smaller organisms might need less nutrition per their mass, they're going to need more energy than maybe animals that are of a greater mass. Um, they're going to have higher metabolic rates because they are going to breathe faster, their heart's going to be moving more, and that blood volume is going to be moving throughout their whole body as opposed to a larger animal. Activity is also going to play a role. Um, your activity is going to help us determine what your metabolic rate would be, and it's going to be inversely related to how long you're doing that particular activity. So, as you continue to do the activity, your metabolic rate is going to decrease. And we'll see a little bit more about that on the next couple slides. Okay. So, on the one on the left, it's just showing that relationship between your rate and your basal metabolic rate and your body mass. The smaller you are, um, you see that your basal metabolic rate is going to be smaller as opposed to the larger animals. Now, why does the graph flip on the other side? The one on the other side, if you look, there's one extra thing on the y-axis, and it's per kilogram of that particular species. So a smaller organism, if I take its mass and divide it into its basal metabolic rate, it is going to require more energy to help to maintain that weight than, say, a harvest mouse, a little bit bigger than that, or say a dog, or a horse, or an elephant. So the larger you are, the less you will need to your basal metabolic rate will decrease in terms of completing all that your body needs, as opposed to a smaller organism has to try to keep everything going all at once. Larger organisms aren't going to have as much as high of a rate to be able to get everything accomplished. So, why we would need different rates for that. How we use our energy is going to depend on what that particular organism needs. And so, the main areas we're going to see it are going to be in terms of maintaining that metabolic rate, what types of activities you do, how much thermoregulation is required, whether you're growing, how much growing is taking place, and whether you're reproducing. So you can kind of see where things break down for the endotherms. And it really just depends on what's going on as to where your relationships are going to be there. Whereas with the ectotherms, it's pretty much evenly divided between the metabolic rate and the activity. That those are going to be the areas that are going to be of greater value with your energy. If we look at the three endotherms, we have the female human in the temperate climate, the penguin for Antarctica, and then we have the female deer mouse in temperate North America. We notice that with the female deer mouse, it's got a lot of thermal regulation taking place. It's a lot smaller. It's a lot easier for it to lose heat. So it's going to require more of its energy to help to maintain its heat. Whereas we see for the penguin that's brooding, is taking care of its offspring. So it's going to have a greater percentage of its energy being used for activity. And then for the female, we see that she is expecting, so she does have a fair amount for taking care for reproduction. So, torpor and hibernation. Torpor is a physiological state where we reduce our activity, and because we're reducing our activity, maybe we don't need as much metabolic processes to occur. This is a way to save energy and not have the internal body become the internal organs and tissues in the body start to encounter difficulties. Hibernation is one way that we animals have been able to adapt to extreme cold and food scarcity. I thought this one was pretty well. Summer torpor, called estivation, allows animals to survive for long periods of high temperatures and scarce water. And daily torpor, which is what our animals would more likely be encountering if we were not at home right now, would be exhibited by lots of small animals and birds, and is adapted to their feeding patterns. Um, I know my cat typically would just kind of chill out unless it was time for food, and then yeah, she would be all after that. So it's not terribly surprising that our small mammals and birds are going to have times where their activity is going to be lower because they don't have to do anything right then and there.